Hello and welcome to this Royal Television Society panel on the international trade in scripted formats and the art of adaptation. I'm Andrea Esser, Professor of Media and Globalization at King's College London, and I'll be your host for this evening. For the past 25 years, the business of selling TV formats globally and of producing local adaptations has been booming. But this boom mostly concerned unscripted shows, game shows and talent competitions, reality TV, factual and lifestyle entertainment. Companies such as Fremantle Media, Endemol and BBC Studios did much to professionalize the business of adapting unscripted formats across the world. Scripted shows, however, appear to be a lot more challenging. In general, scripted shows like the UK's The Office or Danish-Swedish crime drama The Bridge are more expensive to produce than most unscripted formats, so the risk is much higher. Is it worthwhile to buy a scripted format? Questions like this are the ones we'll answer tonight, especially if we consider that many adaptations fail to live up to buyers' expectations. We need to know what are the problems if a scripted format is considered to have failed. Was it the quality of the adaptation in question that was lacking? Was it the cultural divide that was simply too great for the scripted format to translate well? Particularly in relation to comedy, industry insiders have argued for decades that comedy doesn't translate. However, several recent format sales seem to prove them wrong, and we'll also cover that. So, in general, we have some questions to cover tonight. What travels well across the globe? What makes for good or bad adaptation? Is it the format itself? Is it the creative team behind it? Or is it something else entirely? Joining me to answer this is an exciting panel of experts from around the world. First up, joining us from London, is Sumi Konuk, Creative Director for TV Formats at BBC Studios. Sumi has responsibility for an extensive formats catalogue of over 200 titles, including Luther, Dr. Foster, Criminal Justice, and The Office, alongside many popular non-scripted formats like Top Gear and Strictly Come Dancing. We also have Marianne Furford Boland, Head of Drama at Norway's NRK. Marianne was previously a producer for the hugely popular real-time teen drama Skam, Shame in English, which has been adapted 8 times from Germany to France, Italy to America, the latter courtesy of Facebook Watch. So we're looking forward to hearing more from Marianne about Skam. From Singapore, we're joined by Sabrina Duguay, EVP for the Asia Pacific region at All3 Media International. Sabrina's team oversee the sales of completed programs and the local adaptations of the formats to the region, most recently with a deal to adapt ITV's Liar for Malaysian audiences. And last but not least, here in London is joining us Matt Baker, who after a career in senior roles in communications, including stints at Viacom and Channel 4, is now known as the writer for the UK adaptations of Professor T, Before We Die, and Suspect, originally Belgian, Swedish, and Danish series, respectively. Welcome, Sumi, Marianne, Sabrina, and Matt, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Really looking forward to this session. Before we dive in, just a very quick note that we'll take a few audience's questions for the panel at the end. You can pop them in the YouTube chat or send an email to rts.london@rts.org.uk. So please do send in your questions throughout the session and we'll come back to them at the end. With that out of the way, I want to jump straight in with my first question, which is kind of a general question. What adaptations have the panel seen that worked or didn't work in recent years, and why do you think that is so? And I thought maybe Sumi can start us off and then hand over to Sabrina.
Yep, great. Thank you so much, and thanks for having us here today. Okay, so unsurprisingly, I'm not about to dismiss anyone else's work as not working, because everyone goes into any adaptation wanting it to be a success. But what I'd say is a good adaptation is basically one that works in the local market. I know that's obvious, but if it's pulling in an audience, then it's job's done. Oh, I've got a weird bit of feedback. hopefully it's okay. So yeah, I'd say that having a universal theme or story is pretty crucial. And I think an adaptation is all about staying true to the core DNA of the story, and not damaging the brand. And that localization is absolutely key to success, to make it feel culturally relevant, to connect with the audience. So if I take Dr. Foster as an example, it's all about infidelity, which, let's face it, is pretty universal. We've remade that in 10 territories to date. It's been hugely successful, but it has looked different in different territories. So, you know, we did it in the Philippines as a 105 episode run, which still only took the narrative of the first 2 series, believe it or not, spread over 105 episodes. So they did it more as a daily soap, at 20-minute episodes, because that is what worked for the market. You know, a totally different number of episodes, but still the same narrative arc. Or elsewhere, we have done it, you know, in India, which had the same number of episodes, but we did things like the mother-in-law character, who's slightly more minor in the UK version. She lived in the house with Gemma and Simon in the Indian version, because that would, you know, the mother-in-law would live in the house in India. So I think it is all about sticking to the core DNA of the story, having universal themes, but localizing it to make it feel culturally relevant. And also helps as well if you can bring in huge talent, you know, great casting that the audiences are going to want to see.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. I think we'll come back to the Dr. Foster example maybe when we also talk about the challenges of adaptations. But maybe Sabrina can say a little bit about her experience.
Thanks so much for having me here today with you. So scripted format has definitely been a key part of the business at All3 Media over the past few years. I think for a few reasons. The main one is drama series have been adapted all around the world, or needed all around the world. All the global platforms want local content, all the regional or local channels and platforms also want local content. And there's such a need for scripted series. So I think when we talk about why even the business is there in the first place, there is a need of a lot of scripted series, and the demand is higher than the supply at the moment in a lot of countries. And I think why, I mean, we can go into a bit more details of that maybe later on in the questions, but definitely scripted format helps to fast track that process of bringing a show to air. So when the demand is so high, as in some countries like in India at the moment, it really helps the broadcasters to bring shows on air quicker. And to your question also on what works and what doesn't, I mean, Sumi brought up a lot of very good points. It's not because the drama series is very successful in the original country that it will work as a format. And I think it's always a question, why should we adapt it? Is there a reason to really adapt it in that local country? So fast tracking the process is a reason, but it doesn't mean it's going to be successful. It needs to add something to the story. And generally, it's about resonating with the local audience. Why would the audience want to watch local version more than the international version? So it's about finding the right partners, the right players, producers, and platforms to make sure that if we are going, if there is an investment, a lot of investment into a local series, there is a very good reason why. And again, happy to go into details of several examples of why we should adapt scripted formats and maybe some why we shouldn't later on. And to give you a clear example for us, we've had very successful formats, including Liar. I think we're up to 11 adaptations internationally. In my part of the world, Malaysia is one of the latest ones. We are going to launch this later on this year. India also has been adapted, and it's a clear example of the local version will resonate a lot more than the original. It's obviously about a sensitive topic. It's about sexual assault and rape. And if we want the audience to identify to the story, it's obvious that having local actors set in a territory that they can feel close to, identify with, the message is going to obviously become much stronger and therefore attract a much larger audience than the original version.
Okay, thank you very much. Mariana, I'd like to ask you because, you know, Skam was so popular with teenage audiences across the world, to the point where many teenagers from Asian countries, for example, come to Norway now, study Norwegians, want to come be a student in Norway. With such a, you know, an appeal globally, why, and I want to come back to this question now, of why adapt in the first place, and what was your experience of taking a format that was already popular around the globe, but then still making 8 local versions out of it? Were these local versions considered to be successful, unsuccessful, or were there differences between different regions and countries?
Well, that was a lot of questions. I will try my best. But first, thank you so much for having me here. It's amazing to talk about Skam, because it's quite overwhelming how it has been embraced by the whole world, the universe, it feels. But I think it's because it has a core storyline that makes resonance to us all. And the one thing that has surprised me the most is that this little tiny, quite traditional story about these Norwegian teenagers has become a story that so many can relate to, regardless of borders and culture and sexual genders, whatever. And it shows us that we are humans beings that are maybe much more alike than we might think. And in these times, I think that is very important to remember. But back to your question or questions, why has this become such a success, and also in their own versions? Because I must say that I'm very proud of all these 8 versions so far. Still, there are interests in making, you know, new versions globally, which is amazing. But I think that what they have done, and which we were very concerned about, was that finding the essence that felt relevant and authentic to their target audience. You know, not making a copy paste of the Norwegian original version, but going out and doing research, doing a lot of inside work, and finding what it was that was important for the teenagers in their present, in their society, to make sure that it became a tool for them.
So have the stories changed quite a bit in Germany and Italy and France and other territories?
Yeah, definitely. We had to do some changes because there are some local things. In Norway, we have Russebus, which is something that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. There are differences in how how long they are living with their parents. In Italy, for example, it is not so accustomed for teenagers to move out of their houses as they did in the Norwegian version. So, you know, we had to do some local different focuses for the characters and the storyline. But I think that that's important, and I think that's also, it's a part of their local successes.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Thank you very much. So let's stick a little bit to that. Sumi mentioned keeping the balance, identifying the core of a format, and then finding the right amount and the right ways to adapt it locally. So maybe you can bring in Matt here. From your perspective as a writer, Matt, how do you approach, you know, when you get an original show and you're asked to adapt it for the UK? Where do you start?
Well, again, thanks very much for having me. I think where you start is what's required is a sort of weird mix of confidence and sort of humility at the same time. I think you have to have the confidence that you know the local audience better than the original creators of the series you're adapting do, and that's why you've been hired, and that's what gives you license to sort of change and adapt the material you're working from. I think building on what others have said, the recipe for a successful adaptation is one that retains the essence of the original but builds and develops it. I think the way I like to think of it is doing a cover version of a hit song. You know, there's no point covering a song if you're just going to pretty much repeat the interpretation and the sound of the original. What you've got to do is to take it and turn it into something creatively different. It has to work in its own right. If it's a sort of hybrid or a mishmash of multiple people's creative visions, it's more than likely that it's actually going to fall between two stools and it won't work. So I think you have to have the confidence to take good original source material and turn it into something different. But you also need humility. I think you need to know when something works and it can't be improved, and it's better that, frankly, it's better than anything you might come up with yourself. And I think that's probably something that's particularly true of humor. But I mean, at the end of the day, adaptations of original dramas are the same as original dramas. They depend on the same elements of success. They depend on storyline, character, jeopardy, surprise, psychological credibility, particularly relatability. So you've got to retain what works. And I suppose what I would say is that, when it's done well, it can be phenomenally successful. You asked us to name series that adapts that have worked well. I mean, some of the biggest, most successful, series in the world are adaptations. If I name Homeland and Ugly Betty to name but two, they're both remakes of original series, which proves when you get it right, you can have a huge hit on your hands.
And how about, and that's a question that maybe Met wants to start with again, but then that's a question to all of you. How much involvement is there from, the original writers or those selling the format on their behalf? Because if you look at unscripted formats, there's heavy involvement from the copyright owners or intellectual property right owners. There's a lot of control on the one hand, but also you can say a lot of support. There's a lot of guidance to make sure that the brand isn't damaged and that whoever adapts the format kind of gets the core right and doesn't lose the brand value. I assume there's a lot less involvement in scripted drama. Are people just handed, like the story, and then someone tells you, Matt, just go away and do whatever you like, or is there still involvement?
Well, in the series that I've adapted, now we've done 2 seasons of Professor T in the UK. We've done 2 seasons of Before We Die, and we've done a season of Suspect, which was based on a Danish original called For Horet, which I'm not sure whether that's the correct pronunciation. So we've done plenty, and I haven't had any involvement from any of the original producers or creatives. There was a suggestion that the director of the Flemish original Professor T might have been involved in the original series of the English adaptation, but that didn't come to pass. I think personally, from a creative point of view, I think it would make it much harder to adapt if there was involvement of the original creative teams in the adaptation. I mean, the whole point of an adaptation, as I've said, is to change, to adapt, to make it your own. And I think it's sort of harder to discard and get rid of things and bring new things in if you've always got the sort of original creator sitting on your shoulder. It's a bit like buying a property and then sort of gutting it and rebuilding it or remaking it. You can keep the outdoor, you keep the framework, but you change everything else, and you don't want the person you've bought the property from sort of telling you what you can and can't do with the property you've acquired.
I think that tends to be the case across the board as well. I mean, obviously we love to have our creators involved, but in practical terms, they've often got very little involvement because they're busy on their latest project. So it tends to be more about keeping them across what we're doing. And it's the flying producer, our flying producer for scripted is a script editor. So he's the one that will, fully understand that format and the core DNA of it, and will work locally with the writers to make sure that they've got enough flexibility to do what they want to do, but just keep it true to the format. And I think, if you agree, Matt, but where it gets really interesting is when you have a show that goes beyond the original series. So we've got Peter Moffat's Criminal Justice, which, the original was Ben Whishaw, who was kind of working class everyman, taxi driver who gets accused of murdering a young girl. Then in the US version, The Night Of, it was Riz Ahmed, where race and religion came into it. That was the same in the French adaptation. In India, they did it as more of a kind of, he was a privileged middle class, slightly more privileged middle class character, but you were dealing with open prisons, so that played heavily into his experience of the justice as a system like that. But in India, they're now doing season 3. There were only ever 2 seasons in the UK, and it's been so successful. They're doing a 3rd season, and that this time they're looking at the juvenile justice system. And obviously, this is a brand new story. Still got some of the key characters, but then I think for writers as well, they can sort of really take that somewhere new and different, which is really exciting.
Is there a difference though between countries? So, you know, we've got in the world, we've got more developed TV markets like the US and the UK, and then we've got less developed TV markets historically. Is there a difference in how much support there is for the writers who are adapting, or the production companies who are adapting a scripted format when they have less experience, or maybe less experience with a particular genre? Do they get more support then? And it's the more developed countries like the US and the UK where the format owner just kind of steps back and say, do whatever you want with the format?
I think for us, I mean, for me, on age-specific drama, we make sure that the people who are going to collaborate with the production company and the writers in place really understand the original idea, meaning that we trust them from the beginning that the changes they're going to make are going to be suitable. I would say we're not heavily involved either. It's much more of a consultation. We discuss the changes, but they tend to be always related to, for cultural reasons, the changes that have to take place. To your comments on depending on the country, yes and no, in a sense that the need for format adaptation, I mentioned India earlier on, and I think it's an interesting example. There is obviously a very strong culture of drama in the country, but I would say more on feature movies, and then on the other end, the soap, very long running soap. So suddenly when all the VOD platforms came in and wanted 4, 6 or 8 parts, that was something that was not really done before in India. And the writers were not necessarily used to that type of writing. And for sure, at least a lot of our series fall into that category of the 4 to 8 parts that is highly needed at the moment, but there were not enough writers that were maybe trained or just used to that structure, where then therefore adapted scripting format completely made sense. They were accessing fantastic formats, scripts from great writers, and they could then localize it. So that's really, I would say, one example. But then in terms of the writers we work with, it's a question for me of trusting they're going to do a great job. We've adapted also Miss Fisher Murder Mystery, which is an ABC series in Australia, to China. And the changes were more, again, it's cultural, a little bit like Sumi mentioned. In some of her adaptation, they doubled the length of each episode. So we ended up having a series 1 of 30 episodes. It's a period series, so they changed also it's not in the 1920s, it's more 1930s, just to fit the local culture. So all of that is in discussion, but it just makes sense for the adaptation in China.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got a question actually from the audience that won't keep till the end, but bring in here because it's perfect for our discussion at the moment. Question comes from Krishan Aurora asking, when it comes to selling drama formats to US platforms and channels, what are the particular challenges in selling into such a competitive market? And especially with the US, you know, those, as I said, it's very competitive, it's very experienced, and a lot of the US adaptations actually are considered failures. So is the US a special case to sell into?
I mean, I could just talk, for me, all I could talk about is our comedy. I mean, I don't do the selling. I can just talk about, I mean, we've had not unusual success, but normally it's hard for comedy formats to travel anyway. But actually, you know, we've done 3 big US adaptations. We've done Call Me Cat, which is a Miranda for Fox, Ghosts for CBS, and This Country, which is Welcome to Flatch, which is also on CBS as well. And I think what has been interesting with those is that I think with comedies traditionally, everyone feels like they're harder to travel. I think you obviously need to allow a bit more freedom. Comedy is obviously very subjective, and you're going to get those direct comparisons because they're both English language. But I think it's just all about, whether or not it's resonating with the audience. But if I take Ghosts as an example, that, it's a really delicate process between sticking to the original, but allowing the showrunners room to maneuver. So what they've done in that version is they've kept some characters are really close to the original. So you've got Pat and Pete, who are scout leaders, similar characters in both versions. There is Lady Fanny and Hetty, who are both uptight society women of a certain era. There's two military characters, one in each version. But then in the US version, there's been brand new characters that tap more into US history. So there's sort of a Prohibition era jazz singer. There's a disgraced Wall Street trader. And what they did as well, each UK season, it's been 4 seasons in the UK, are 6 episodes long, but a US season is going to be 18 episodes, which obviously is going to eat up 3 series worth of material. But with Ghosts, it was just the first 2 episodes were very similar in season 1, were very similar to the UK in terms of, young couple inherit a house, and one of them ends up being able to see ghosts. But from episode 3, it goes in quite a different direction. And, we needed to allow them room to be able to take it in the way they wanted to take it to, because the volume is so huge, and with comedy they need to just be able to write it and make it the humor sit with the American audience in the right way. So yeah.
Is that a general trend that in the US scripted formats get adapted more than in other countries?
Sorry, what do you mean? In what way?
Is that a general trend that in the US there's more local adaptation, or to a bigger?
I think they're probably, there is, because they tend to do their. I mean, look at The Office. The Office was 14 episodes in total, I think, for the UK series, and over 200 eps for the US version. So yeah, there's got to be freedom for them to be able to do whatever they want to do with it. And it's, a successful comedy, they're going to want to run it in huge volume, which we don't do, in such great volume in the UK.
Yeah. What about, maybe a question to Mariana, what about Skam for Facebook Watch? Was that a kind of an adaptation that stood out, that was very different from the other adaptations?
Well, it was different from the other adaptation regarding its publishing format, because it was on Facebook Watch. They had a different kind of algorithm than we had in the other countries. And but regarding the content, I mean, it was the Norwegian team more or less who went over there to do the show. So I think that it is a great show, but it hasn't maybe reached the hugest audience of all the adaptations. But I think that has much to do more with how they formatted, how they were broadcasting it, and it was quite a new way for the American audience to embrace. But I was thinking about when the question earlier, because we have done some other shows in the US as well, Eyewitness, for example, which is a Norwegian original and a UK original. And I think that, that was a great one. And we have been in talks and doing the same show in other countries. I think it all goes down to the production companies and what kind of relationship you have with the ones that you collaborate with. I don't necessarily think it's, the US go down bad, or it's about how you're working together and the trust, and as Matt said earlier, how they are constructing their own version.
Mm-hmm. Good. Let's talk a little bit more about who to adapt for. Are we talking, so when formats are sold across the globe, but then also those people adapting them, rewriting them, who do we have in mind? Who, is it the broadcaster, the streaming platform? Is it a national audience? Is it a very small, target audience? And also, do you have the fans in mind of a format when rewriting something? Who do you think of?
Shall I start with that? I mean, from a writing point of view, you always start with the audience, but obviously when you're adapting something, you're thinking about the audience very specifically in the home market of the broadcaster you would consider to be the commissioning broadcaster, which in my case has been either Channel 4 or ITV, or in one case ITV and BritBox. But of course, even with an adaptation, you're thinking about international market as well. I mean, Professor T, for example, has sold in the English version of Professor T has sold in 100 territories globally, and probably gone to markets like Japan, for example, that the Flemish original would never get a chance of reaching, at least on a sort of mainstream broadcast context. So you're obviously thinking about, you have to creatively think about an audience. If you're not thinking about an audience, it's not going to work creatively. You're obviously thinking about the platform and adapting to the platform. And I think you're thinking about trying to bring a new audience to it. I mean, obviously, in the case of the series I've been working on, we're adapting from foreign language drama into English, and I'm working through a company called Eagle Eye, which is a sister company to the Walter Presents streaming platform, which is showcasing the best of foreign language drama around the world. I think the principals of that company, Walter and Joe, have a really good overview of what drama's working well in which market, and they have a good idea of where success has, which series they've got working across their platform, which has been successful in a number of different markets. And I think that's what's guiding them towards the decisions they've made about which series to adapt. So yeah, I mean, to summarize, it's very much about, you're always starting with the audience as your starting point and a specific national audience in mind, but you know, as a writer, you have to be aware of the commercial realities you're working with, and that also includes, serving a commissioning entity, whether it's a streamer or a broadcaster in your home market, but obviously trying to create something which is going to be commercially successful internationally as well.
And maybe a question to everyone. So when you also always kind of today have an international audience in mind, even though you're doing a local adaptation, are we just talking about English language adaptations here, or is that true for other languages as well, that you kind of have an international audience in the background of your mind?
If you want me maybe to start with this one, I think overall the most important is to reach the best audience possible for the commissioning broadcaster. It's a plus, I would say, if internationally it can work, if that version will travel, it's a plus. But the main reason of commissioning a series is that it has to work for the original commissioning broadcaster. I mean, I would say when we look at why we would sell a scripted format, I feel like there are three main reasons why we should adapt. One is to reach an audience that the original version wouldn't have reached. And that can be for various reasons. If I obviously use the example of my side of the world, the audience watching Liar in Malaysia, the local version, is certainly not the same audience that would watch the UK version, because the UK version will be on a very different platform, maybe on the pan channels, but would not reach the same audience. Or it can be maybe Blood. So it's an adaptation we've done in India, local versions called Masoom on Disney Plus Hotstar, that really found a fantastic audience in India. The original version is an Irish version. The original one definitely would not have reached that audience. So I would say that's the main reason, is to reach an audience the original versions wouldn't have. The second reason is to complement the first or the original version. So that could be anything like Criminal on Netflix, I think would be a good example, where they've done several versions of the format in different countries that complement each other. They have the same structure, but each of the stories are different. And as an audience, you may start watching the UK version. You're like, this is so good, I want to watch more. Where can I watch more? And then you start watching the French version or the Spanish version. We probably had the same with our format called Accused, the BBC One format, where the adaptations took the same structure of one person in a jail cell walking towards the courtroom where they're going to know if they're found guilty or not. And then that walk towards the courtroom, we have flashback of what happened and why are they accused today. And then the story was different in different countries. So in this example, I would say you complement the original version. So you just give more to the original audience that you have. And I would say there may be a third category, which I would call nostalgia or nostalgia, right? So it's maybe format that have been, or series that have been incredibly successful. Maybe I could use Suits, for example, in the US, where I have watched it, I have loved the US version, but suddenly when Korea or Japan they did their local version, enough time has passed, plus the local version would be different enough that if I want to watch a Korean show, I'm like, okay, I've watched the original version, but I'm very tempted to watch it again, but maybe a localized version.
Mm-hmm. So am I right in thinking it is very helpful then actually to think about the different types of audience? You don't just have either an international audience or a national audience, but wherever they are, you've got different types of audiences that get different things from it. I interviewed the British producer of Britain's Next Top Model, and they told me at the time, that was many years ago, the research team found that in Britain they had 3 audiences for Next Top Model. There were those women who, well, mostly women, who preferred America's Next Top Model because it was the most glamorous. Then those who preferred the British version because they could identify most with the characters. And then the people who loved the format and who would just, watch the British version, the American version, the Canadian version, the version from New Zealand. Is that similar for, it sounds a bit from what Sabrina just said, similar for scripted formats as well, especially for a streamer who puts on different versions?
Yeah. I was going to just to build on what Sabrina had said about bringing it to a new audience. With Before We Die, for example, the Swedish original, which was a very successful and much loved series, in the UK, it got a sort of across the first showing of the first series, I think it averaged 300,000 viewers, which is, I think across All4 and All4 is a very, very respectable audience for a foreign language show. The first episode of the English language adaptation, which we did, reached an audience of 4 million people. So it just shows you the sort of quantum that you're talking about. Across the first series of Before We Die, more than 15 million. We've had more than 15 million views on the All4 platform for the series. So you're bringing it, particularly with English language adaptations from foreign language, you're inevitably bringing it to a much bigger audience. Now, look, there's segmentation. Of course, there's the core audience for the foreign language original who discovered it, love it, may never watch the adaptation. Then there's the English language viewers who will watch it, probably a much bigger part of the audience. And then hopefully there'll be people who will cross over and watch both and appreciate that they're trying to do different things. They're not necessarily trying to serve the same purpose.
I'd say from our point of view, our approach is slightly different because most of our scripted dramas are originating in the UK and then being sold internationally. Actually, when we're making an international adaptation that's non-English language, then first and foremost, we're absolutely making it for that market. So because it's unlikely that we are going to grant the rights for that to then go into any other country, because we want every other country to make their own version of the show. So yeah, it can, the English language version can help drive local format adaptations because people want to see their own version. Everyone wants to see their own version of David Brent. But we absolutely would focus on the platform or the channel that we're making it for locally and their specific audience in an adaptation in that territory, and not think so much about whether this is for non-English language, whether or not this is then going to sell elsewhere, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. The question that comes to my mind now, what about copyright? If you have a market, any given market, and there's suddenly maybe so many different versions, the original version, the English language version, then their own local adaptations, are there problems with copyright today? If you sell to different broadcasters and streamers, and they have so many different versions at the same time? Do you encounter problems?
I think it's really come down to the strategy around the brand. We make sure that when we have a new brand coming in, we have, with the team, we sit down and we think, okay, what is more important? Is it to sell the original version, or is it to give a priority to the format in that territory? Obviously, each market is different, but it has to be a conversation, because then the rights negotiated are also going to be impacted. It's definitely a challenge, especially on some big brands like, Liar is a good example. It's been adapted in 11 countries. Some platform has been adapted on broadcast in few countries. So you need to make sure there is no overlap. And it's only by really having a strategy in place at the beginning, being very conscious of the rights needed that might clash between the finished tape and the format and the various local versions of the format, that we can maximize the opportunity for that brand.
Okay, and you don't encounter any problems for any broadcaster saying, but we've just kind of bought the rights for that version, so we don't want you to show another version in the market?
No, of course we do. I suppose it's also going to depend what territory it is. I mean, let's face it. Let's say there is a big BBC show that we sell into Australia. Obviously, the Australian broadcaster won't want another English-speaking language in the market, right? We wouldn't want that. It doesn't make sense. The broadcaster wouldn't want that. However, they probably won't mind if it's, let's say, it's a Malaysian version that is on a tiny, small pay TV platform just in Malay, for example, right? Or a Philippine version that is also on reaching just that. So it's also where languages come into play. There is a lot of negotiation in place at the moment in terms of what rights do people have to dub or to subtitle. So yes, there is definitely some challenges. We just need to make sure that everything is discussed and upfront and on the table at each negotiation.
Also, it's all about the funding, isn't it, originally, and how that's been funded, and how you need to, you need to make your money back on the tape sales first and foremost. And so, we probably would put out a scripted format into the market. It's not going to be on air before 2 years earliest of the original version being out there as distributed as finished tape. So it's about your strategy for that show, how it's been funded, and then we have a clear view on when we will take a scripted format and make it available for adaptation in any market. And we'll also know exactly, everybody would know whether the tape's been sold there, and that would all be worked into the deal.
But I think it's definitely important to say that in the recent years, the format adaptation have been sometimes more in specific countries generate more revenue than the tape sale, and therefore there is really a huge emphasis for us to focus on that. To date, we have 10 formats in APAC, in Asia, really, that have been on air or commission or in production at the moment, and another 6, 7 that are in development. So it's substantial. It's definitely a big part of the business.
Okay, can we maybe come back to that question of why adapt in the first place rather than write something from scratch? I mean, Sabrina has mentioned that several times, and throughout our talk so far, there has been the odd sentence here or there, but can we maybe come back to that point again and note down a few bullet points? So why adapt? One of the things I remember that Sabrina said was you're quite quick at adapting, so you can bring something to the market much more quickly. Anyone else who wants to?
I think yeah, speed, cost. It can make it more relatable for the audience if it's set in your own country. People have comfort and familiarity, and they want to watch their own stars. It also gives huge marketing potential. If you've got a big streaming platform and you've got a known brand, but you can reimagine it and bring a big name to it, then that's going to drive audiences to your platform. So I think there's some of the reasons, and also why. I mean, people love to see a retelling. It's kind of why adapt Shakespeare, Chekhov, Ibsen in the theatre. People love to see a new adaptation of something.
I think from a buyer's point of view as well, I mean, it's if you're adapting something that's been provenly successful in another market, it gives you a level of reassurance and confidence. It's a bit like, you know, drama commissioners always love to commission. I feel I'm more inclined to commission if there's a book version of the thing. It sort of gives it a kudos and an authenticity, I think. And the truth is, you know, it's coming back to the point about logistics and quickness. I mean, I can. You know, I'm lucky. I mean, I have done original drama, and you know, I know that what's involved in developing for original drama. And the truth is, with certain types of drama, and I'm thinking particularly of crime procedurals, the development process is just much quicker. You've got the framework, you've got the outlines of the story. Of course, you're going to change character. Of course, you're going to change background. Of course, you're going to creatively reinvent, but you're starting from several rungs up the ladder if you've got a usable structure in place, which you can tweak and develop and adapt, rather than, you know, you're staring at a blank sheet of paper. And you know, the truth is, you know, if you can truncate the development process into a matter of weeks and months, rather than in some cases a matter of years, it's you know, in terms of today's market where there's such huge demand for high volume of scripted content, it's a real point of difference, I think.
Yeah, it's been through a filter, hasn't it? And a lot of people have done some of the hard work for you before it comes to you.
Yeah.
Can I also just put in that I totally agree with everything that is said, but it's also a way of trying out new genres that you haven't tried and you have in your repertoire for some time, and trying to test out new things that might be not so familiar to your local audience. And we done that, and it was a huge success. So I think there's a lot of good science in trying to look into adaptation as well.
Mm-hmm.
Just to add a concrete number to what Matt said, I think our fastest turnaround on the scripted format adaptation was for Liar in Italy, that was done within 10 weeks. It's not always as fast, but obviously that's incredibly short. So fast tracking the process definitely worked in that instance. Wow.
It is another reason that, I mean, there's so much demand, you know, there's so many big streamers these days, then the broadcasters in every country, then a lot of digital niche channels. Is it also that there's so much demand for scripted content that, in a way, then there's not enough creative talent to fill that demand, and that therefore formats, you know, are a quick way of getting content?
I wouldn't say there's a lack of creative talent. I think there's tons of creative talent. I think it's probably about risk and broadcasters, platforms wanting to feel like they're reducing their risk when they're putting a lot of money on the table, as opposed to the availability of talent.
I think for me in Asia would be the lack of talent. There is fantastic talent. It's just that the demand is so high with all the new platforms that there is just too much demand compared to the amount of writers. And talking to the broadcasters, but also the production companies, they're just saying we just can't hire enough people and enough writers. And therefore, for me, definitely one of the big reasons has been helping writers and production company to bring show on air quicker.
Okay. Well, we wanted to give 10 minutes to audience questions, but I've got one last question before we come to that, and probably Sumi and Sabrina are best placed to answer that because you've just come back from MIP. Are there any scripted format trends that you'd like to share with our audience that you've picked up at MIP, whether it's particular genres, whether it's kind of a new country that's in the limelight, that everybody's watching and wants to know of?
Oh, I don't know. Me and Sabrina are stumped. I think it's still I would, you know, it's always, you know, crime's always big, you know, big, strong female-led dramas. There wasn't anything particular, I don't think, that came out. I think people were talking more about, you know, co-pros rather than actually the genres of scripted, you know, particular areas within scripted. I'm obviously going to say comedy, because comedy is working very well for us. Sabrina, I don't know, is there anything that jumped out for you?
I would say in territories where the scripted format market has been developed for quite a while, including India, including, maybe Korea, China. They're in India specifically, they're really willing to go beyond the crime series. Until now, we've done most of our adaptations have been around crime. I would say 80% of them, then a little bit of romantic comedy. But now they're willing to try new things. They're willing to try a lot of young adults, edgier series. And then the smaller territories, obviously we did Malaysia, but smaller territories now also looking at scripted formats where they were not before. So I would say the genre has been broadened up a little bit in terms of the interest, and some smaller countries also looking at scripted format, which is really exciting for us.
Brilliant. We have one question from the audience concerning the uptake in foreign language content, especially on streaming platforms, young people watching the originals in any language with subtitles. Do you think that's going to put a dent on scripted format sales?
I'm happy maybe to take that on. So while you're completely right, the big global streamers have definitely opened up the audience to different type of content, or content coming from different countries. I mean, 10 years ago, I don't think if you were to ask people, they would not have willingly watched a lot of maybe content from Korea or from Spain. But here we go, Squid Game happened, Money Heist, and everybody has watched them. So from that point of view, I think definitely the audience now knows that a good series can come from anywhere. It doesn't have to come from an English-speaking territory. Saying that, it does not, I think, conflict with the importance of having local version done in Korea or done in Malaysia or in the Philippines with their local talent. I think they work alongside of each other. And for me, it's more now, hopefully, people in outside of Asia are definitely more willing to look at Asian content and looking at Indian content or Korean series.
Yeah, I think it's exciting. I think there's so much demand that there's room for both. Definitely, I don't think they're impacting each other or impacting sales. I mean, everybody, the scripted formats is one of the biggest growth areas. So it's definitely not been impacted by it.
Good. There is also another question earlier about from the audience about kind of comedy and the complexities of comedy, and we've already talked about this in some aspects, but I want to just clarify: is comedy because it's deemed more difficult to adapt? Do you still think the comedy genre is more difficult to sell and more difficult to make it work in other markets than other genres? Or is there, because the recent examples have been quite positive with some comedy adaptations, do you think comedy just joins all the other genres in being seen as interesting formats to acquire?
I think I mean, I would say, we've had success with comedy, so I'm obviously going to sing its praises and say that if it's about getting the right talent in there and finding the right fit for the buyer, and also it's about appetite from the audience, isn't it? And we're at a time at the moment where people aren't wanting such dark content. They want uplifting, warmth, happiness, joy. So that leads into that, and maybe that means that broadcasters are willing to take more risks because there is an audience demand for it. But comedy's always, it's definitely a trickier genre, but it's about being flexible and allowing people to, make it in the way that it fits locally for their audience. I don't know if that answers the question.
No. I was just waiting to see whether anyone else wants to jump in. I've got another question from Krishan. Asking, are format adaptations a good training ground for new, younger writers as a basic framework? Or does one have to be actually really highly experienced to be able to do an adaptation?
Well, I'm the living proof of that. You can see I'm obviously very young and very fresh-faced. Um, no, I started on an adaptation. That was my first project. I kind of moved out of. I'm one of these lockdown pandemic stories where I used the moment to give up my career in corporate comms and decide to do what I'd always wanted, which was to write professionally. So I think it's a valid point. I do think probably I started on Professor T and moved on to Before We Die, and I've used that as a springboard. And hopefully the proof of the fact that the proof of the fact is that both those series have come back for second series, which I think is sort of testimony to the creative team behind them, but to proof of the fact that my scripts obviously passed muster, but it has also given me a springboard to go on and can write my own stuff. So I've done 2 series of a series called Hotel Portofino, which has been on BritBox and PBS and Foxtel and Sky Italia. So it's definitely given me a springboard. I do think it's a valid point. I think it's a little bit like bit like having training wheels when you've got a path before you. And actually, from my point of view, as I've become more experienced as a writer, I've definitely gained the confidence to sort of take the wheels off, if you like, and learn to use the framework of the original story as a guide, but not to be too slavishly, not to follow it too slavishly. I think so there's definitely an opportunity there to sort of progress and to use these as platforms to bring on new creative talent and to Sumi's point, although there is a lot of creative talent in the industry, there seems to be insatiable demand for scripted comment at the moment. So there's always going to be a need for more.
Okay, Matt, can you maybe finish with kind of like 3 bullet points of advice for someone who wants to adapt a scripted format for the first time in their lives? Things you've learned?
Well, make friends with a producer is probably the starting point, because nothing really happens in the business without somebody who's prepared to champion your idea. I think know the market. You've got to, you can't work as a writer in isolation. It's a lovely idea that we all sit in our ivory towers and write what comes to mind. But television is a commercial business. It's a creative business, but it's a commercial business. So you've got to know your buyer, but also trust your instincts. It's not the process of adapting stuff. Some of the greatest stories in the world are adaptations. I mean, Hamlet's not an original story when Shakespeare wrote it. So trust your instincts. Pursue. Trust your creativity. In terms of getting into the business, that's I've got no advice to offer. You can't. That's the great challenge for writers, coming through. But once you're in, trust your business and know your audience.
Brilliant, thank you. Maybe to finish off, we're coming to an end. Are all of you kind of looking across the world for interesting series to adapt? And is there like a series each of you has found that you would really like to see adapted for your own market?
So we don't look actively outside because all our stuff comes from the UK. But one of the 2 shows that I would love to see adaptations of are, I'm obsessed with Am I Being Unreasonable? I watched the whole thing on my delayed flight back from Cannes. I just think Lenny Rush was an incredible young actor. I'd love to see that remade in any territory. And I'd love to see a non-English language version of The Boys, if anyone wants to make that. Not my show, but I'd love to see that as a non-English language version.
Thank you, Sumi.
I've got Eagle Eye Joe and Walter. They're out there kind of looking at all the new foreign language shows coming through, and there's an adaptation, an idea for an adaptation that we're working on together. So I have a new one which I can't tell you about, but just to come to something I would love to adapt if I ever got the chance. But it's actually an English language show which I think would work brilliantly in any market, but is prime for localization, and that's The Bear on Disney Plus. It's a show about cooking. It's a show about passion. It's obviously very culturally specific. It's about Italian Americans in Chicago and salt beef and all this kind of stuff, but it would work brilliantly for me in any market, and I think it would be a great fun show to adapt.
I'm just going to say, Matt, that was my show as well.
Sorry,
yeah, because it's an amazing show, but it still feels very local, even though I'm sitting in Oslo, Norway, watching it. And also, even though we are not doing much adaptations, Somebody Somewhere, which is an American show, I think also it gives a resonance to how it is to be a human being trying to find someone to love.
Mm-hmm. We've got one more question from the audience, so I'd like to bring that in. I'm sure we can go over for 5 minutes. And this is, I think, what we haven't talked a lot about the unsuccessful shows. But this is really actually a really good question, because Abby is asking, are there examples of adapted works that were not hugely successful in their original market when they came out, but were still adapted and were then successful in the localized versions? Can you think of anything?
It's an interesting question. I don't think, but again, coming back to the point I made originally, the idea of the idea of adapting something rather than doing something from scratch is the reassurance you've got that it's already worked in another market. I can't really understand the logic. I mean, obviously there are hidden masterpieces in every art form that people feel haven't got the audience they deserve, and I'm sure there are shows out there that people feel passionate about that perhaps haven't succeeded. But the logic of doing adaptations probably mitigates against the idea of adapting something that hasn't worked particularly well in its home market.
I think there will be examples. It's just trying to think off the top of our head. Whether someone who's just taken a risk on something that they just loved the story, and for whatever reason it didn't work and it's in original territory. But I can't think of one off the top of my head. But I'm sure there are examples.
Yes, Sam, I would say I'm sure there has been some. I mean, and if I look at the show that we are adapting, at the moment, we have closed some deals on scripted format of show that were not necessarily a huge success, are not necessarily traveled hugely internationally, but where they felt the scripts were very good and actually would just work in that market. So again, I'm not saying they were not successful at all, but they don't have to be a huge success internationally to work as a scripted format. Again, if we go back to why, if the why is because in that local market, it resonates with the audience and the story just works, then, why not adapting it? So I think that's something important. Equally, it's not because it's a huge success internationally that it will work as a format. And actually, I would probably be sometimes a bit concerned, or depend on which territory. But it could also be a problem if the original shows have been incredibly successful, because maybe then the audience will be more tempted to compare it, depending again on the country. And if that original version is very, very well known in the country you're adapting it, that could potentially set the bar really high and be a challenge. There's been some examples of exactly that happening in Asia, where the original version was very successful, a Korean series, for example, watched by everybody. And then when a smaller country like Vietnam done the local adaptation, the version was good on its own, but people unfortunately compared it to a Korean version that had a very different budget, and therefore suddenly it was not as successful as it could have been.
Thank you. I've got one last question from an audience member that I'm taking now, and then I'll wrap it up. And I think that's a good question, actually, for Marianne. It's a question about the use of social media in advertising new adaptations. And I was thinking of Skam again, because I know that the original Norwegian version wasn't marketed very much, because you actually wanted teenagers to find the shows on their own and then make use of the word of mouth marketing. But then, of course, all the adaptations came along. So did marketing at that time on social media play a big role?
The social media was such a huge part of the show. It was like a character of itself. So in one way, you can say, yes, we did not have a promotional strategy at all. We wanted the kids to find the show by themselves. But by using social media, you know, when you got into their mobiles, they did the marketing for us. So I think that's a challenge in generally now, not only for adaptation, but for scripted or non-scripted as well, is that using social media smartly to getting, you know, especially the young audience is very crucial, because they are not sort of for our perspective, you know, the big national broadcasting company having a promo, a trailer on 8 o'clock on a linear channel, you know, the young adults, they don't watch that. You have to find them on their own arena. So if I'm not sure if this makes sense or it was an answer to your question, but you should definitely look at how to use social media cleverly and wise to get your audience engaged. And it's a great way to communicate with them as well, you know. And as they did with Skam, they created their own community on social media, and then they did the job for us.
Okay, brilliant. I think that is a very nice kind of closing statement, very optimistic. And I just want to thank the panel. It's very exciting to have you here, and thank you so much for contributing. I want to thank the audience for joining us from wherever you are. This is the great thing about social media as well, that all of you now have an international audience and not just people here in London. So thank you to all. And I just wanted to finally say that for the audience members who want to find out what the Royal Television Society is doing in the future, you can go to the website of the Royal Television Society, and there's all the events, future events are announced there. And now I've forgotten the address of the Royal Television Society, but I'm sure you're all clever enough to Google it and to find it. So thank you very much again on our 4 panelists and the audience across the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Andrew. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.